Ancient history is fascinating. For so many sites around the world, we simply do not know how they were built. If you believe that this is the first age of advanced technology, then the building of these structures using only primitive tools is mind-boggling. Unfortunately, without more information, the true building techniques will probably never be found. Most ancient sites are so old that the knowledge about them has long since been lost or forgotten, and all that remain are myths and legends that seem too impossible to be true. However, there are modern structures built in the last few hundred years that have many similarities in their construction to these ancient sites, like the absence of cement or mortar, for example. These sites are often overshadowed by ancient sites because it is assumed, since they are so recent, we know exactly how they were built. The truth is, we know just as little about structures built 200 years ago as we do about structures built 2,000 years ago. Or, in the case of this episode, a place built only 157 years ago. Say hello to Fort Negley and Fortress Rosecrans, the two largest forts built during the Civil War. Though built in the 1860s, these forts are still among the largest forts to be found in America today. The official story is that these forts were built in just a few months. What's even more remarkable is that this was achieved using a labor force of thousands of uneducated slaves. To say the least, these forts are unique engineering and historical marvels, which is the very reason why it's so strange that they don't get any recognition today. Perhaps it is because their story, when scrutinized, will only leave you with more questions. Now, the first question I had was, why are star forts still being built in 1862? By the time construction of these forts began, the great majority of star forts around the world, including in America, had been abandoned due to being ineffective against gun warfare. There is so much information in this rabbit hole, I had to split it into two parts. In part 1, we will examine the forts themselves, and in part 2, we will examine the life of the man behind the forts, Chief Engineer James St. Clair Morton. Thanks for tuning in to 30th. Let's get started. The American Civil War occurred from 1861 to 1865 between the Union and the Confederacy. In 1862, Confederate forces were driven from Tennessee. Their attempts to hold Nashville failed, and they were forced to retreat. Immediately upon securing Nashville, Union forces began plans for a fortification. Being in such a strategic and important position, this fort was vital to completing their defensive line. The decision was made to bring in a highly decorated young military engineer, James St. Clair Morton. Rather than the usual procedure of using trained military personnel for the construction of the fort, Morton chose to use the newly freed slaves of Nashville who had come to the city after hearing it was now under Union control. Promising them their freedom once the fort was finished, slaves were rounded up by the Union military and forced, sometimes at gunpoint, to work on the fort. In total, it is estimated that more than 2,700 slaves were used to construct the fort, of which over 800 died, and many of those that survived were never paid the money they were promised. The construction is impressive even by today's standards, with Fort Negley being one of America's largest bastion forts. It is the second largest fort built during the Civil War, comprised of 62,500 cubic feet of stone and 18,000 cubic feet of earth, at a cost of $130,000, which today would be roughly $3.3 million. The fort itself is approximately 180,000 square feet. Using slaves who were uneducated and had never built a structure like this, James St. Clair Morton was able to build this structure in an unbelievable 3 months. Let's have a look at this chart I made to see exactly how amazing this is. It is quite unfortunate that once again there is no record of the construction methods used. No blueprints, no documents of any kind that can support the claim that 2,700 slaves were able to build this hill and fort in 3 months. There is one old picture of Fort Negley that shows a very rudimentary log fort sitting atop a very sophisticated stone structure, which is in itself strange. You've got to ask yourself why. Why is this structure on top so primitive compared to the stone structure underneath? Why wouldn't you continue to build with stone? Why suddenly revert to a much more primitive method of construction? Now, after this amazing feat of engineering and all those lives lost in the effort, the official story is that this fort never saw battle. How is it that these decorated military officials all over the world keep getting it wrong, building these huge star forts with amazing amounts of effort only for them to never see battle? The Battle of Nashville ended up being fought much further south, near Shies Hill on the Cumberland River. So for all that effort, not only did this fort not see battle, it was apparently abandoned right after the war and was never really used for anything, not even as a storage facility. After being abandoned by the military, the fort was secretly being used by the KKK, who still had a strong presence in Nashville even though it was under Union control. According to Marcus B. Toney, who was a Confederate veteran, a Klansman, and a Masonic leader, the fort was secretly being used as a meeting place for high-level KKK members during the Reconstruction era after the Civil War. The story continues to get weirder. In the 1930s, well after the forts were declared obsolete, the Works Progress Administration attempted to begin a restoration project for Fort Negley. World War II is cited as being the reason the project was stalled and ultimately failed, even though once the war was over, there was no attempt to go back to the restoration project. Strangely, the fort was allowed to fall even further into disarray, so much so the only people who ventured there were criminals, racists, and vandals. Touting the minor criminal activity as the motivation, the government closed the entire fort and hill off from the public and added trees to the breadth of the hill, claiming this would help deter any gatherings or activity at the fort. The problem is that the trees had the opposite effect and actually helped to hide all activity on the hill, including hiding the fort itself. Fort Negley would sit there, closed off from the public and abandoned by the military for over 50 years. The WPA did not raise proper funding for the restoration project until the early 2000s. Funny enough, the majority of those funds were used to remove their own trees from the hill.
It's a Nashville treasure that's been hidden for more than half a century. Civil War buffs have known about Fort Negley for years, but now the city is about to reopen it to the public. News Channel 5's Barry Simmons gives us a sneak peek as crews rush to get it ready.
Behind the stone entrance and the locked gates is a fort so concealed no one's seen it in almost 60 years. Fort Negley, once among the most neglected Civil War sites in the country, is finally getting some attention. Crews are paving roads, building walkways, and an observation tower over what once was a battlefield.
They had cannons in every direction, but most of the fire was concentrated to the southwest because that's where the Confederates would have come from, most likely.
What was going on at the fort during those 50-plus years? Thanks to the trees, the fort was all but forgotten by locals. Disappearing from the news altogether, many attended the nearby minor league baseball games without even realizing what sat atop the hill right next to them. What they also did not know was right next to them were thousands of unmarked graves. In 2018, a proposal called the Cloud Hill was put forward. It called for a mixed-use redevelopment of the entire fort and surrounding area. LiDAR scans were performed for the proposal's archaeological survey, which revealed many graves spread all over the area, putting a quick halt to the project. According to William R. Cornelius, an undertaker commissioned by the Union Army, he buried over 30,000 people around the fort, of which around 10,000 were black slaves or refugees. If that is true, then the 800 slaves reported to have died during the construction is gravely under-exaggerated. This is also supported by a written statement from an officer of a black regiment who said people were dying in scores, sometimes 30 per day, and their bodies were taken by wheelbarrow and dumped into a mass grave. An interesting note, it is said that the fort was built in 3 months, which is 90 days. 30 people per day is 2,700, which is the same number of slaves reported to have been working on the fort. It's a strange coincidence. It is said that the stones of the fort were quarried from the hill itself, yet there is no area of the hill that shows stones were quarried from it. Here's something else that's a bit odd. It has been determined that the hill is man-made. Before the fort was built, the place was known as St. Cloud Hill, which would imply that the hill was already there. Which begs the question, If the hill already existed before the fort, and the hill is man-made, who made the hill? Is it actually one of the many native mounds found across the USA that this fort is built on? At some point after the fort was finished, the Union's Army of Ohio Command was taken over by General William S. Rosecrans, who changed the name of the army to Army of Cumberland. James was given command of a pseudo-engineering unit called Pioneer Brigade, which totaled around 2,600 men. While training the Pioneer Brigade, James's rank was gained the prestige of Brigadier General of Volunteers. James's Pioneer Brigade proceeded to do very well in the Battle of Stones River, which happened at the end of December 1862. The work was far from over, as immediately after the battle, even though the last fort did not see battle, James was directed to begin plans and construction for what would be the largest fort built during the Civil War, even bigger than Fort Negley, called Fortress Rosecrans. The Battle of Stones River ended January 2, 1863, and by June 12, 1863, Fortress Rosecrans was being garrisoned by over 2,300 soldiers. Fortress Rosecrans covered 255 acres and had a perimeter of 3.5 miles. Using a force of 4,000 men, mostly slaves and newly freed slaves, James once again pulled off the amazing feat of completing the fort in mere months. Of the original 14,000 feet of earthworks, only 3,000 feet remain. As you can see, much of the fort has been destroyed to make room for a golf course and tennis courts. The walls of Fortress Rosecrans averaged 10 to 15 feet in height and 25 feet in thickness at its base. There was also a 10-foot ditch in front of the walls. There are some very strange rock formations that ultimately gave the river its name, Stones River. It's an odd place to choose to do battle due to the extremely difficult terrain created by those very stones. The result was that the Battle of Stones River was one of the bloodiest battles in the whole 4 years of the Civil War. Both sides incurred huge losses, as it was next to impossible to properly defend any position. So what do you think? Were these forts built in mere months, or is there more to the story? Were these forts actually built for the reasons we are being told, or were they built for an entirely different purpose? Were these forts even built, or were they found and reclaimed like so many ancient sites around the world? If the story is true, why did James St. Clair Morton use such dangerous building techniques that it sacrificed the lives of the very people the Union was trying to protect? Thanks for watching part 1, and stay tuned for part 2, where we will look at the strange and mind-blowing rise and fall of Chief Engineer James St. Clair Morton's career and the possible dark truth behind his story.